Good morning and welcome to everyone here and online. I'm Claire McHugh. I'm a freelance journalist from Britain, and I was part of the ICFP reporting trip around Colombia in August. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here today with Jen Schuber, who is a renowned political demographer, the president and CEO of the Population Reference Bureau in Washington, D.C. Jen is also the author of 8 Billion and Counting, How Sex, Death and Migration Shape Our World, which focuses on how demographic change is affected by politics, security and economic prosperity and vice versa. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you so much. Great to be here with you, Claire.
I think it's particularly fitting that we're here today in Bogotá, which has a lower fertility rate than Tokyo. It's one of the many cities around the world that's growing old before it's growing rich. Now, Jen, like lots of economists are telling us that falling fertility rates, shrinking populations means less innovation, reduced economic output. Do you agree that we're moving towards an economic emergency, or is this actually an opportunity to reframe how we think about population change and fertility?
I'm going to do the cheater answer and say both, because it really is in the response to things. And if there's anything we've learned over the history of population, it's that there's not some perfect age structure or some perfect fertility rate that leads to, amazing economic growth. Even when we look at things like East Asia's rise, two countries can have the same demographic structures and really different outcomes. And that shows you that while population is incredibly powerful, it is not the only thing to look at. So when we think about what could be happening in terms of the economy, a lot of it is going to be in the response. If we stick our heads in the sand and continue on with business as usual, not recognizing that we have to change our infrastructure around care or our systems around work and retirement, or even relationships between men and women in society, then actually we could end up with seeing these economic strains that are foretold in the doom and gloom scenarios, but they are not destiny. And I think our job is to put more into the research and case studies to understand under what conditions do we see societies really thrive. And the second part of what you asked is really interesting as well, like where do we see opportunities here? Just the fact that we have these lower fertility rates is in large part a testament to the hard work that's been done over decades and decades to really put in place structures, mechanisms, clinics, financing to allow women the choice about when to reproduce, whether to reproduce, and how many children. And so we don't want to skip over what we've really seen as a success story all the way to the doom and gloom without sitting in this moment.
Thank you. And I think this idea of holistic societies and well-being is really important there. Another aspect of well-being is planetary health. You were previously a professor of environmental sciences, I believe. Many environmentalists would argue that fewer people, fewer babies is better for the planet. How do we square that argument with these warnings from economists about economic decline and that side of things?
I don't think we'll ever settle this, because what it really is at heart is how do different people privilege the planet versus people? And when you have this very ecological perspective, it puts the planet at the center, and then kind of humans are here to either destroy it or support it. What we often try to do with talking about population and the environment is have more of an environmental view, which is different from this ecological view that allows this more harmonious relationship. And in that case, it's not people-centered and it's not environment-centered. It's looking at these two things together because we both exist together. What we're finding is some really mixed things about the relationship between people and the planet in terms of depopulation these days. There was an article in NPR that I saw this morning, and the assumption is fewer people means a cleaner environment, and therefore great. Don't always find that to be the case. In fact, there's some really interesting peer-reviewed research coming out of Japan that shows that because people have been so intimately involved in managing and maintaining the environment through farming for thousands of years, once those areas depopulated and farmers were no longer managing the ecology there, you actually saw declines in some species. So I think what we want to be careful about is just assuming a relationship without going into the evidence, which at PRB we're always all about. What does the evidence actually show us? And I find that with population generally, things that might make the most logical sense don't necessarily bear out in terms of evidence, so it's worth the time to really see what's true. I think when we talk about going forward, where we're going to have more debates around the number of people in the planet is we've for so long had of our theories, and we may talk about this in a few minutes more, but everything we know about the world was devised in this era when it seemed like there would be unending population growth. So I think mentally we need new models to think about what it means when we have over 40 countries that have now hit peak population or on the decline. We are going to need new vocabulary, we're going to need new theories, and we're going to need to rethink some of these fundamental questions, such as what is the relationships between people and the planet.
Over 40 countries are moving towards population decline. That is a striking statistic. And I think another interesting parallel with climate change and the way we talk about climate change is this crisis language that's around population change. And, we hear about the global crisis in fertility and dire demographic decline. Why is that?
The historical perspective is also useful here. It seems that we've never had it right with population, or often we could say women have never had it right. They're never having the right number of babies. I think it's like the old fairy tale with Goldilocks and the Three Bears. The porridge was too hot, the porridge was too cold, it was never just right. And it seems like no matter where we are, women are either seen as having too many babies or too few. And the elusive perfect number is just out there. In some ways, using crisis can be useful. And the environmental movement has seen this as well, because what does crisis do? It motivates you to immediate action. And when we're in these times when we at least feel like resources and attention are scarce, and you want to mobilize something to your cause, it can be very effective to invoke this feeling of crisis. There can also be really negative consequences of that. And I think some of it we have seen from the environmental movement, and we might want to learn this with population as well. Two areas. One is when you invoke crisis, you don't get to determine how people are going to use that. So let's just use this example of many years ago, like in this decade still, but at the beginning of the decade, there were several estimates around climate migration and the expectation that there might be, 200 million people move. That was a useful talking point for the environmental movement in hopes that it would mobilize resources to reverse climate change. But that is not all that happened, and you don't get to decide what people do with that information. So some of what happened was a huge backlash against migration. That was the unintended effect of that. Could we see the same thing happen with using crisis language around population? Sure. We've seen it when we used crisis language around overpopulation. What would be some unintended consequences? Restricting rights, forced sterilization. And the same could happen around depopulation. So while it's important to put these issues on the radar of decision makers, we do need to understand that we don't get to control what they do when they say, you are right, this is a crisis. And I think we're in that moment right now. We've seen it happen with higher fertility rates. We're in that moment now with lower fertility rates, where a lot of really influential people have cottoned on to this and said, this does seem like a problem. And then what they might do about it may not be what many people in our network had intended for them to do.
Yeah, we're already seeing those unintended consequences and backlashes in the form of the pro-natalist movement, particularly in the United States. And just, you have a book coming out soon, don't you, called, well, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about your book and why you've chosen to write it and why it's so resonant right now.
Sure. So this new one is called Toxic Demography, Ideology and the Politics of Population. And it's, I'm a political scientist, and I co-authored it with a demographer, Michael Teitelbaum, and a historian, Jay Winter. And what started off as a kind of intellectual exercise for us about 6 or 7 years ago, I was going to say, unfortunately, became incredibly relevant as the discourse around population shifted in that time. At the heart of this book is our argument that it seems like every time, historically, we look about the last 70 years, we try to talk about population in a very scientific way. It's hijacked by the political agenda. And people, it's infused with all these ideologies about like who should be in the family. Each country, each decision maker has their own opinions about this at time. The ideologies about nationalism, ideologies about what does it mean to have a modern state. And so we'll see decision makers in countries all around the world, because that's what we find is it's really universal. They come to this issue around population, the rainbow of issues around population, with those ideologies. And so policies that they put in place tend to be more reflective of those ideologies than really based in evidence about what those policies might do. And let's just say, for example, policies around reducing fertility rates. Well, they're usually not just around overall. It might be they have preferences that certain subgroups would have lower fertility rates or slower growth than others. You know, who should be having children? All of that is really what we're talking about in the book.
So your call is for less politics driving policy, a more data-based, evidence-based approach.
That would be so great. I think one of the things we find in this book is you can't separate them entirely, though. But that's why the more we bring it out into the light, the better it is. So we know we can't really take the politics away. So let's just point out where it shows up.
Thank you. And just to finish, could you give us an example during the course of your research and your travels of a particularly pioneering policy or city around the world where you think they're adapting really well to population change?
That's a great question. You know, a couple places I've gone recently, well, Busan recently in South Korea, and as many people know, South Korea really has the lowest fertility rate in the world, and Busan has been really worried about this because they're trying to maintain their reputation as a real global city. So I think this may not have come to mind for a lot of people, but they're really putting an effort behind being a global city. And so in some ways, believe it or not, marketing is actually one way to have adaptation. There are others, but I've been really intrigued by the way that they know they're not going to attract people to necessarily move there. They're not going to change the tide and all of a sudden be a growing city. That right there is progress around adaptation, because it's so many places that are all fighting to have that growth, and they're missing other opportunities. I was very impressed that they're like, yep, no, this is where we are. So what are we going to do with what we have? And they have looked some to Tokyo, who's been able to have certain enclaves in the city where they've attracted foreign residents in order to have some growth there. But you can be a cool city. That's actually an adaptation. Now, we could also talk about, like, at the company level, we're going to have to do a lot of things to adapt about rethinking what it means to work or retire, and how can we blur the boundary between those two things, which can also not only help us with older workers, but have the intended or intended side effect of actually making it easier for women to have children and work at the same time as well.
Thank you very much. So we have tourism as a new form of migration, increased productivity for longer, perhaps voluntary or playing a bit around with the retirement age. Jen, thank you so much for being here with us. That's what we've got time for today. Thank you.
Thank you.